Hey guys, Doug the Motherboard Guy here, and this is the pilot episode of my new YouTube channel that I'm starting. This will basically be a channel where I go over some interesting or just plain old motherboards that I happen to own. Mostly kind of focus on older ones, go over some of the features they have, some of the interesting things about motherboards from that time frame, and stuff like that. So if you like old computer parts, if you like motherboards, if you like specifications and stuff like that, then you should probably hopefully enjoy it. So first episode, right now we're going to go over a motherboard that came in a computer that I actually used to have and that I no longer have, but I kept the motherboard around. This motherboard came out of a Gateway G6-400. And this motherboard is a slot 1 ATX motherboard. And again, this came out of a Gateway computer, so this is OEM motherboard. This was manufactured for Gateway specifically. It has some built-in code that basically makes it so that the recovery disks that came with the motherboard, with that computer, only work with this motherboard. Ports that it has on the back, I'll show you guys this. So this is pretty standard for what you would get back in the late 90s and around early 2000s, very early 2000s. You have your two PS2 ports, you have a couple USBs, two serials and a parallel port, and then built-in audio. OEM motherboards around this time tended to have built-in audio, but most of the retail motherboards you would buy around this time did not, and so you'd have to purchase a separate sound card a lot of the times. So very basic by today's standards. You didn't really have a whole lot of USB. That was just really actually a fairly new thing back when this was made. And as far as other things that are on this motherboard, set this right here. So we have obviously our CPU socket right here. We have 3 memory slots. These take SD RAM. This motherboard has the 440BX chipset, and so it supports PC66 and PC100 memory. And being that this is a OEM motherboard that came in a computer, it has no overclocking options. You can't set it to run PC 133, for instance. It'll accept that kind of memory, but it'll only run at 100 megahertz. And then you have your ATX power connector. This old of a motherboard does not take any extra auxiliary power from any other connectors. So you don't have like the 4-pin for extra CPU power. The CPUs back in this time did not take enough power to warrant having an extra connector for that. So then floppy connector. So that connected to your 34-pin floppy cable, and it supported, this is an old enough chipset, it supported 2 floppy drives simultaneously, so you could connect an A drive and a B drive. The idea there was to have a 5 1/4 and a 3 1/2. So this actually does support that. It is old enough for that. Then you have the front panel connectors are actually up here. So this is what would connect to the front of the computer for the power button, power LED, the hard drive light, and all of that stuff. You've got your 2 IDE channels, each supporting 2 drives. So you get your master-slave configuration for each one. This has 1 AGP slot and 5 PCIs. The last PCI slot is shared with a 16-bit ISA slot. And so you had a lot of connectivity for cards in this system. The AGP slot is 2x only. It's 1x, 2x. So 1x was really only used on a very few cards at the very beginning of AGP, but this only supports 2x. A lot of cards were 2x and 4x capable, so you could run things like a Voodoo 3 AGP in this board. And that pretty much sums it up. You've got your CMOS battery. It does have a built-in speaker, so you don't have to connect a separate one. And Yeah, that pretty much summarizes it. And one of the other kind of interesting things with this motherboard, it is old enough to have an audio input for your CD drive. So you would have a dedicated cable running from this port to the CD audio jack on the back of your CD-ROM drive, and that would bring digital CD audio from your CD-ROM drive while listening to audio CDs and put it directly into your integrated sound card on the motherboard. So when you connected speakers, it sounded as good as it possibly could. It sounded just as good as you having, a dedicated CD player. It didn't have to go through a whole bunch of processing by the computer. And one of the other things with this motherboard, I do have a processor, because I kept the processor that came in this gateway computer, the G6-400, and based on the model number, you should be able to figure out the processor that came in it. That's the retention module. This is the Pentium II 400 megahertz. This was a slow enough version that it could be cooled passively, that is without the use of a direct fan, although with this speed you really would want to have a lot of airflow through the case, so you'd want to make sure you had an exhaust fan behind this in the case. So you've got your connector here that goes into that slot on the motherboard. I'm going to do that in a second. But along the top edge is where you would find all of your specifications, your processor model number, your serial number, and things like that. And interesting little note here, I don't know why, but there's this relatively common misconception that this is the actual processor die. It is a picture of what the processor die looks like under a microscope, but that is not the processor die itself. It is literally just a sticker that Intel decided to put on the plastic on the outside of the processor cartridge, just kind of make it look cooler. And another thing to point out about this processor, or at least this type of processor configuration, the reason why it is on this card is due to the type of cache memory. With the Pentium II, it was new for Intel to have level 2 cache memory built directly on the processor, and they were large chips. Previously, these were chips, level 2 cache chips were put on the motherboard, and with the Pentium II, they were using faster cache memory. It was faster than the motherboard. So this processor, for instance, it's a 400 megahertz. It would run on a 100 megahertz bus speed. And so previously on original Pentium processors, your cache memory, say your motherboard was a 66 megahertz bus speed, then your level 2 cache would run at 66 megahertz. Well, this being a 400 megahertz Pentium II, it actually contains level 2 cache memory that runs at half of the processor speed at 200 megahertz. So it's considerably faster than the 100 megahertz bus speed, which it makes things run faster because a lot of times the processor is loading things directly from level 2 cache, and so it can access that much faster. But those chips are not actually manufactured by Intel. That's why we have, there's just a circuit board inside of this assembly here, but Intel didn't want to make it known that they were buying memory from other manufacturers to use as their level 2 cache memory. So rather than exposing the inside of this and you'd see branding of Samsung or whatever brand of the level 2 cache, they put this plastic cover over it so that you don't know that. But since I told you, now you do. So now, final little part here, I'm going to stand the motherboard back up, and I'm going to go ahead and install the processor, it just pushes in place. Now I understand that I'm not doing this with the retention module, and that's just because I'm only doing this temporarily just for show. The retention module I have sitting right over here. This attaches to the motherboard and then helps to keep the large processor cartridge in place when the computer's being moved around, so it doesn't cause unnecessary stress on the processor slot. So I hope you enjoyed the video. In the future, I'm going to be showing off other motherboards that I happen to own or ones that I acquire. So thanks for watching. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.